When timepieces moved from the pocket onto the wrist, they were much more susceptible to shocks and impacts. So something that was required was a new development to protect an extremely delicate and important part of a timepiece: the balance wheel and the balance staff. Sometimes you'll see watches marketed as shockproof. And what that means is they're including some sort of shock setting to protect the balance staff and the tiny little pivots that are on either side of that staff. Those tiny pivots hold the heaviest wheel in the watch, and it's a large, heavy wheel because it's like the pendulum of a clock, just in a round wheel shape. But it needs to have the tiniest pivots because it has the least amount of torque all the way at the end of the gear train. So when you mix that heavy outer ring of the balance wheel and two very tiny thin metal pivots, you have a weak point, and it's perfectly fine if it's something operating on a desk as a table clock, or even something in a pocket where it's much less likely to be moving around while we're talking or hit on a door frame. Or back when watches made their way to the wrist, would have been something that you may have been climbing around in the trenches, firing guns. That shock going through your wrist is a large impact of force through the watch, which can easily break off those pivots and render the watch useless. When we go back to pocket watches, if you open them up and you take a look at the balance wheel, the jewel that is on top of what we call the balance cock, there will be a jewel setting where that axle runs for that wheel to go back and forth. On the older pocket watches, you'll have just a through hole with one jewel and one hole, and that is it. When you look at a modern wristwatch, looking at that same part, you'll see a jewel and some sort of spring over that jewel. Now that is the shock setting. And there's one on the movement side of the watch and one on the dial side of the watch. And the pivot runs in between those. Now, there are different trademark names used for those shock settings. A really standard one nowadays, which is still around, is Incabloc. An Incabloc shock setting is very similar to all the other shock settings that are out there. The main important differentiating factor: you first have a bushing that is solidly set in the bridge. You then have a jewel that is held loosely so that it is mobile and can move within that bushing. You then have a cap jewel which goes over the top just to cover it and press the ends of the balance wheel, so that caps the balance wheel pivot. And then on top of that, you have a spring that closes and holds that in place. Now the spring is really thin, a brass material, and that allows for that whole setting to shift around in any direction within the bushing. So if you have that large balance wheel and you use it as a lever and you press down on either side, as you press down, it will allow the pivots of the watch to move without breaking, because the jewel is no longer solid set in the bridge. So it's certainly a more complex timepiece because you have more parts, but it's a much more robust timepiece. The different trademarked versions will use different shaped springs. You'll see some look like triangles, some look like two prongs. They have different shapes, and what the trademark holders claim is that it will bring the jewel setting back into the center after a shock. So each one kind of claims that they do it better. I'm not sure which one truly does it better, but Incabloc is the most common one. And then you also have Rolex that has their own trademark version of the same spring. And of course, those are very common because Rolex is one of the largest watch producers in the world, and they have been for many years. But regardless of the trademark name, they're all doing the same thing, which is allowing the balance wheel and the balance pivots the freedom to swing back and forth in the case of a shock. Many times, if you look at old pocket watches, you'll see that they've been put away because the balance staff was broken, and they made their way into a drawer and never came back out. It's one of the weakest points on a pocket watch. And this is part of the reason that pocket watch movements aren't great to be converted into something to go on the wrist unless you can update them with a new Incabloc shock setting. Otherwise, you have to be very careful to make sure that you don't knock it on something or drop it. But even a watch with Incabloc shock protection, if it's dropped onto a hard surface, there may be other things that go wrong, but you probably won't have a broken balance staff. Replacing a balance staff is a pretty time-consuming thing. On a modern watch, oftentimes a watchmaker will simply order a new balance. It really depends on the price, and if that watch is something that is very rare, then the parts will be more rare as well, which would mean the parts are more expensive, and it might actually be worth it for the watchmaker to make a new balance staff and re-pivot that balance. But if the parts are inexpensive enough, because it's a higher production watch, then a new balance with a pivot already put in there on an industrial scale would just be ordered and then replace the balance complete, as we would call it. But on an older pocket watch, it's very rare that you will find a balance complete that can be swapped right in. So that's usually something that requires a watchmaker to get either an industrially produced balance staff and then put that into the balance wheel, or make the balance staff on a lathe in their workshop and then place that into the balance wheel. And this can be an expensive job because it does take quite a bit of time to make that part and to replace it inside of the watch. And that's why oftentimes those pocket watches ended up in a drawer, because the cost of the repair was so high. A modern wristwatch really isn't complete without some sort of shock-proofing method. And that's why you don't really see it on the dial anymore, because it's standard. It's good to know what makes a wristwatch different from a pocket watch. And the shock setting for the balance wheel is the most important development, bringing a watch from the pocket or the desk onto your wrist.